Welcome back to Neranenah Scholars. I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation with the great Ben Sidran today. Today we'll be discussing Bob Dylan.
Bob Zimmerman from Hibbing, Minnesota, who was searching for a new name, even as a teenager. He tried using the name Elston Gunn. He liked that, it didn't stick. Eventually named himself Bob Dylan after Dylan Thomas. He changed the music business forever and for good. And one of the things he did is he made professional songwriting kind of obsolete, because after Bob Dylan and some of his acolytes like the Beatles and whatever, you wrote your own songs because it was assumed that you were telling your own truth, because the 60s were all about telling your own truth. We were not going to be like the previous generations. We're going to be who we are. We're going to do it our way. And here's Bob Dylan, who became enamored with folk music, with Woody Guthrie in particular, with the Dust Bowl songs, with the songs of social justice. His first great hit, Blowing in the Wind, by Peter, Paul, and Mary, their version was a hit, made it possible for Dylan to carry on, not just as a songwriter, but as a performer, because the song was so huge and so powerful that people would overlook the fact that if Bob Dylan sang it, he wrote it, but he presented with a terrible voice. Bob Dylan made it possible to sing a song with an ugly voice. A couple of things are interesting about that. First of all, Bob Dylan has a very nice voice. That voice is not Bob Dylan's natural voice. Just like his name is not Bob Dylan. That was an artifice. Just like his nose wasn't big because he was part Cherokee, it was because he was Jewish. His story was an artifice. But his story, even though it was a lie, it told a truth. It was a lie that told a truth. And this idea that you could make up your own truth, you could live your own truth, really helped give birth to the whole pose of rock and roll. Rock and roll is a pose. The Rolling Stones are a pose. They're not street fighting men. They never were. You know, Mick Jagger was an econ student and whatever. Rock and roll became a pose, in part because Dylan was so convincing that that voice was the real true voice of these poetic words. It was an act, but it was an act that told such a profound truth and captured the spirit of the time that everybody was living in. You have to look at Dylan almost as a social movement as well as a gifted songwriter. Now, people immediately started asking Dylan, where do your lyrics come from? What does it mean? What do Masters of War mean? All Along the Watchtower. What do these songs mean? And Dylan would either say, why are you asking me? I'm the last one to know. Or he would make up these bizarre stories, fantastic fantasies, crazy stories. It got to the point where there was this truth that I'm talking about that is somehow part of, but greater than the lie it came from, helped rewrite the story of a generation. And so it led to things like punk rock, because punk rock picked up on the fact you didn't have to have a beautiful voice. Not only that, you didn't have to know anything about music at all. Not only that, but it was better if you didn't. It was better if you didn't. It led to rap music, because just like Irving Berlin, Bob Dylan, his language swung. I always like to recite the lyrics to Subterranean Homesick Blues as an example. Johnny's in the basement mixing up the medicine. I'm on the pavement thinking about the government. Man in a trench coat, batch out, laid off, says he's got a bad cough, got to get it paid off. Look out, kids. Something you did, God knows when, but you're doing it again. It goes on and on and on. And he's got all these songs that are like this. They just are captivating. Their imagery and they're captivating. And Then years later, like we're talking about Dylan showing up in the early 60s. And then in, I think, 69, he has a motorcycle accident. And he retires for a few years. And when he comes back, he can't channel that voice anymore. He still sounds that way, but he has to work harder and harder to write the songs. They're not natural. And so they become, in their own way, kind of manufactured. You can see in Bob Dylan this, I mean, there's a whole lot. You see a lot about Jewish identity there, even though he didn't write Jewish songs. You'd have to say there's a way to talk about all of his songs as being Jewish songs. The only song that he mentions the Jewish God is Highway 61, where he tells the story of the Akedah. God said to Abraham, kill me a son. Abe said, man, you got to be putting me on. God said, no. Abe said, what? God said, do what you want, Abe, but the next time you see me, you better run. Abe said, where you want this killing done? God said, back down on Highway 61. But Bob Dylan was bar mitzvahed. Bob Dylan has a lot of biblical imagery. He made popular music grow up. So classic that the way he made popular music grow up was through artifice, but not through show business. It was a lie. It was artifice, but it was not show business. And I like that about him. There's a ground level reality to the crazy mad genius that is Bob Dylan.
Oh yeah. I like listening to a lot of his early stuff where you could actually hear different voices throughout.
Yeah. Right.
It's fascinating.
You can hear him playing with that voice.
Yeah, and he did that what's the Hava Nagila Blues or something where he yodeled his way through it.
He yodeled it. Yeah. Right, that was his other Jewish song.
La Hava Nagila
You know Alan Light, Rolling Stone, right? He writes for Rolling Stone. He's an interesting guy. I interviewed him on the festival a couple years ago, and we were talking about Dylan. I asked him, I always get the question, Dylan's Jewish. What's Jewish about his music? And I asked Alan the question. He says, man, in his songs, he answers every question with a question.
Exactly.
He also told me that he was close with Curtis Mayfield, Alan was, and that Curtis Mayfield had a really painful last few years of his life. But he luckily had money because he owned his publishing. And he basically said that, Bob Dylan impressed that on a lot of Black musicians in the 60s, was you got to own your publishing. And it made Curtis Mayfield have it was a terrible time, but made him at least get to be comfortable his last few years.
Well, exactly. Dylan took control of every aspect of his presentation, including the business. I mean, when he finally was able to fire his first manager, Albert Grossman, he never had a manager like that again. He just had an accountant and a helper.
I read recently Jerry Wexler's autobiography, and he was talking about how great he thought it was when Dylan, converted to Christianity for a bit and recorded a gospel album. He recruited Jerry Wexler to get the gospel sound.
Get the gospel sound, because he did Aretha Franklin.
Yeah.
he tried to proselytize with Jerry, and Jerry said, I'm a confirmed Jew, don't even start with me. Right?
When I did first start this job, someone said to me, go to a class on Jewish music. They're holding at a synagogue. So I went to the class, and it was a guy saying, Bob Dylan's Jewish, and he played a song. Then he said, Paul Simon's Jewish, and he played a song. It was that. And, Carole King's Jewish, then he played a song. I'm just curious, how do you think these people would feel knowing that that's what a Jewish music class is to a lot of people? Or do you see what I'm trying to get at with the question?
Well, I'll tell you something that's related to that that's kind of interesting. It's natural for people to teach Jewish music that way, because basically they're coming from, gee, isn't it interesting? the Jews only make up 2% of the population, but 80% of the music. Isn't that interesting? They don't want to ask the question, it's interesting, but what does it mean? Because that's very difficult to tease out. So that's typical. But it brings to mind something that's going on today that's very interesting, and that's this. Jewish history and culture today is primarily being passed along to younger people through university classes, Jewish studies programs. The way I learned it was I'd heard stories of the Holocaust because of my family, or the Hebrew teacher who was a refugee who could barely speak English. He was my Hebrew teacher. I'm one generation away from Europe, right? But kids today are several generations from that experience. And the real question today in America is there still a Jewish story in America? Is the Jewish story Jewish, or is it just another American story? And so that kind of thing, well, Carole King was Jewish and so is Jewish, is probably not going to be allowed anymore, because people are going to learn too much about the history because it's been formalized. It's been codified. On the one hand, Jewish history now is codified, so it will live in a much broader way. And on the other hand, it's codified, so will live in a much less personal way. I don't know what they would think about it, but I think it's a lot like jazz today. If you want to learn jazz, you have to go to college. If you want to learn about being a Jew, you're going to have to go to college.
That's, yeah. I was recently watching that new documentary, When Jews Were Funny.
Yeah, it was good.
It was good, yeah. But it was interesting hearing, some of the comedians say we're the same. We're the same people. We just don't have the accent anymore.
Yeah. But the accents were funny.
Right.
No problem.
Yeah. Just, you were talking about how Dylan made the songwriting business kind of obsolete, and he spoke from, even if he wasn't telling the truth, he was telling a truth. And it just kind of occurred to me, do you think it's a coincidence that in America this songwriting became more personal at the same time that comedy was becoming more personal? That's
a very interesting question. I don't know. I never even thought about that, but yeah, Dylan is our musical Lenny Bruce, for example.
It's a little later, but similar.
It's a little later, but it's the same ethic. I think that this idea about culture having to be truthful might be a later half of the 20th century phenomenon. Nobody assumed that How Much Is That Doggy in the Window was really about whoever sang it, Patti Page or something. It was a song and that was a piece of entertainment. But you definitely wanted to believe that Blown in the Wind was about Bob Dylan. There was something that happened as the generation transitioned from the 50s to the 60s, where this kind of owning it. Look at not just comedy, but the films and the way the films were suddenly more personal and more intimate about American experience. It wasn't like the films of the 30s and 40s, even the noir films, which were supposed to be real, they weren't real. Suddenly everything became more literally truthful, even if they were lies. I think comedy follows along with this. I think that it was a much greater movement than just these two idioms. I think it probably was groundswell of a cultural time.
Oh yeah, and perhaps it started with something like Strange Fruit, where you felt like belongs to Billie Holiday.
Yeah, those were the outliers that brought it. Hard to pick a Bob Dylan song because Bob Dylan so typifies the 60s and the mixing actually of a very spiritual quality, a deep intellectual aspect to pop songwriting, not being afraid of poetics, not being afraid of noetics, not being afraid of mystery and to let questions hang out there, not be providing answers all the time. How Jewish is that? He asked. The song that I guess I'll do Highway 61. It's the one Bob Dylan song that references the Torah. I mean, Bob Dylan, like Irving Berlin, wrote an awful lot of Christian songs. Berlin, of course, wrote White Christmas, Easter Parade. Didn't write any Jewish songs. Well, that's not true. He wrote a song called Cohen Owes Me $97. That was Berlin's Jewish song. Bob Dylan, however, rarely references his bar mitzvah and his tutor, this emigrant, this eminence who came to Hibbing, Minnesota to teach him Hebrew and expose him to the Bible, which became the spine of so much of his work. Anyway, Highway 61 is the song in which he imagines that part of the Torah called the Akedah, where God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. And Isaac, by agreeing to kill his son, proves he loves God enough for God to say, okay, you don't have to kill your son. Now, it's a very troubling piece of music. It's an even more troubling piece of liturgy, because why would God, this wonderful being, ask Abraham to kill his son, his only son, when in fact he had another son, Ishmael, off in the corner? Anyway, Highway 61. God said to Abraham, kill me his son. Abe said, man, you gotta be putting me on. God said no, and Abe said what? God said, do what you want, Abe, but the next time that I'm coming, boy, you better run. And Abe said, where you want this killing done? And God said, Highway 61. Now Georgia Sam, he had a bloody nose. Well, the welfare department wouldn't give him no more clothes. He asked poor Howard, said, where can I go? Howard said, there's just one place that I know. Sam said, tell me quick, 'cause I gotta run. And old Howard just pointed with his gun. He said, back down Highway 61. There are a lot of more verses, but I'm not going to sing all the verse. It's too much. I'll just sing the last verse. Now the roving gambler, he was very bored. He was trying to start the next world war. He found a promoter who nearly fell on the floor. He said, man, I never engaged in that kind of thing before, but yeah, I think it can be very easily done. Put it all back down. We set the bleachers up. We set the bleachers up out in the sun, and we put it all back down on Highway 61. God said to Abraham, kill me a son.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode and hope you'll join us next week. As a nonprofit, we can only afford to put on great programming like this thanks to your support. Please visit us at neranenahArts.org for more information and to learn how to get involved.